some time, particularly in the forest sector, for the Sustainability Fund. And what the Sustainability Fund is a fund that's collected per cubic meter of wood or cord of wood that goes, a levy, that goes into a fund, and then it's spent for silviculture programs, etc. And I'm not sure why the province couldn't establish a Sustainability Fund for agriculture and allow the processors and retailers to pay into that fund and have that money go back to farmers to help cover their costs. And we're really looking at cost of production here. So some people tend to mistake, the fact that how much money are you supposed to let somebody make. This is not talking about above and beyond in terms of profit. This is talking about cost of production and just making ends meet. Now, I think a few of us, Mr. Speaker, have talked about the timeliness of this piece of legislation, Bill 117. Now, I really questioned it, I guess, last fall, because I wondered what the government was thinking about bringing in this legislation now. We could say because it's kind of backdated so that when it comes into effect, the parties are paid money based on the June election. So maybe that was the government's intent, because they would kind of get themselves a lump of money, and we'll be recipients of money as well. But my thought was maybe the government wants to have this in place for an upcoming election, like in the spring of the year. And Mr. Speaker, I think you and I, we don't travel around together much, but we're in the same world generally. And I don't think a spring election for the Progressive Conservative Party would be altogether the best notion politically, for them. So I still have to ask why this piece of legislation and why this piece of legislation now, and I can't come up with a sensible reason. I mean, if the government was to do it in the fall, this coming fall, I might say, well, there's probably going to be an election in 2008. So I think I would probably be getting my head around that. I certainly wouldn't be expecting one in 2007. So the hit will be the same for New Democrats, but yes, the Minister of Fisheries, I think, is going to donate to my next campaign, if I understood him right. I am, yes, I am. I think we're doing okay in that regard. So I have to learn how to vote the right way, Mr. Speaker, before I consider that. We had asked for a 6-month hoist in the fall, and actually had kind of thought that there was going to be a bit of an engagement with the public on this piece of legislation, that we were going to be out and getting some input. And I'm not sure whether that was a misinterpretation on our part. We didn't think the law amendments process was actually going to be the process by which this engagement was going to take place. But anyway, as it turns out, law amendments was the only game in town. So is it our debate, or lack of debate, I guess, for the members on this side, is this going to be the only record of what people think about this bill in this House of Assembly? My colleagues in the third party have been notably silent on this piece of legislation. As a matter of fact, they're a party that, as far as I can see, have had a little bit of power in this House during this period. I really had hoped that they would exercise that power and refuse to support this legislation until the government offered support for the hog producers. And that didn't happen, and here we are. We're going to be out of the House. I don't know if it'll be tomorrow, but it'll be soon. and that's a card that's probably not going to get dealt. And I think it's been a real shame for the hog industry that there wasn't more of an effort by the third party to stand up and fight for them. Now, well, as much as my party and my colleagues in this party have not been enamored by this piece of legislation, I think there has been a good message has come from this, or at least I hope it has. And I know, you know, in the next election campaign and subsequent election campaigns after that, that my colleagues and hopefully, you know, future candidates will be able to stand in their constituencies and say, well, look, you know, at one time, Bill 117, when it came through the House of Assembly, we had an amendment to ban union and corporate donations, which really would have leveled the field as far as representation by the parties. In other words, you know, no one could make the case that you were beholden to any particular influence. And actually, for as often as many years as we've been criticized for our connection, Mr. Speaker, then we will be able to say, well, it was a combination of the Liberals and Conservatives who prevented that from happening. And so they should get those candidates to explain why they weren't willing to get rid of union and corporate donations. But for New Democrats, the federal model has been the model that seemed the most appropriate. The federal government was willing to go down that road. They already had run one election on that basis, and you know, the Conservatives probably should be heartened by the notion that it was a Conservative government that was elected afterwards and didn't seem to you know, penalize them significantly. So this may have been a road that they would have been willing to go down. So, Mr. Speaker, so the question of all that the issues that the province is facing, why haven't we dealt with more that the Premier has indicated? He talked in question period about issues that he would like to see dealt with. He'd like to see the opposition raising instead of the issues around the car accident, and but yet there's been nothing through the process or procedures of the House that would indicate that the government was at all interested in dealing with more legislation or more issues than this one bill. And I mentioned previously about groups that have come to the House of Assembly. I mentioned hog producers on Tuesday. There is the group, and I think they're from the Brookfield, Shorts Lake, that area, and probably Truro area, who have been to the House today to try to make their case around the proposed burning of tires at the Lafarge cement plant. And my impression is they didn't get any great reception from the government side. And with all we know about burning tires and the chemicals that are released with the burning of tires, we don't hear a comment from the Minister of Environment on this. So, Mr. Speaker, here's another group with an issue that the Premier talks about dealing with issues, other issues, and yet is not particularly interested in dealing with them. So, whether it's health, whether it's environment, I know my colleague, our member for Sackville, had mentioned about health always being at the top of the list is for issues that the public is interested in. Actually, I think the most recent polling indicated for the first time ever that environment has outstripped health at the top of the polls, and this is something that maybe this is fueling this change in electoral finance that we see in Bill 117, Mr. Speaker. You know, I think all parties, certainly in this House, were representative of three parties. There is definitely a fourth party that's involved in politics in Nova Scotia, and that's the Green Party. And there was a Green candidate who ran in my constituency last time. And certainly with the federal leader, Elizabeth May, and her reputation and her history, this is a party that I think people should be thinking about. I think that the agenda of this party, which is the environment, seems to be one that's, if recent polling is correct, would indicate that it's at the top of the list for Canadians, and therefore I would expect, Mr. Speaker, you'll see environment become a much bigger part of party platforms in the future, and certainly this bill 117, the way it's written, would probably be disadvantageous to a new party trying to establish itself in this province, and that would bring me back to the charter challenge that my colleague from Halifax, Shabukto, had mentioned in terms of right to vote. So it may be seen as a barrier to entry where you have such small numbers of voters in a new party trying to enter the political realm, and therefore the old line parties being compensated at a much greater level. And I got to say, there is a problem, I think, with taking taxpayers' money and supporting political parties to such a high degree. I think we tend to think, and it's contrary to what most people think, the New Democratic Party relies a lot on the ordinary person on the street for donations to fund our election campaigns, and I don't expect that that's going to change anytime soon. I think in light of our success in the last election, we probably are going to have a greater field to draw from, but there is absolutely no way, as far as I can see, that any party can run election campaigns without donations from the public and without volunteers. And it certainly is my hope that elections and politics here is not going to change too much beyond that. I'd like to think that this is Nova Scotia is a situation where an ordinary person can enter politics, that you don't have to be, independently wealthy or some other financial state that allows you to outcompete anybody else in your neighborhood. I'd like to think that people are actually elected on their salt and what they're made of personally. And of course, there's no separating that from the party you run for. There's a number of things people look for, I think, when they vote for a candidate. It could be the person themselves, it could be the party, it could be the platform, it could be the leader, it could be any combination of those four, and it could be sometimes maybe just one of those factors is enough to make them vote for a particular party. Yesterday, or Tuesday, I discussed the difference in approach of Bill 117 in terms of donations submitted for leadership races. Our party has a pretty low ceiling, I guess, for compared to the other parties in terms of the maximum amount spent on a leadership race, $25,000, and I don't think, in my memory, I don't think that's changed, and so actually, to a point, a bit gratifying to think that someone could actually run a leadership campaign that was restricted to such a low number. If we think about, even the other two parties in this House, not to mention across the country, not to mention to our neighbors to the south, where the just staggering amounts of money used to get people elected. And I referred to one of the newspaper articles where something to the effect of Democracy Watch, the comment that whoever pays the piper picks the tune. And I had used the analogy about the ring in the bull's nose, and whoever puts the ring in or pays for the ring gets to lead the bull where they want. And so I'm not sure if I need to explain that comment. I had a question afterwards about why would you put a ring in a bull's nose? Well, the reason you do is because when you have an animal that weighs about a ton, the usual methods of persuasion don't always work in trying to move him in the direction that you may want to go. But I think anybody could assume that a bull is an animal's nose is a pretty delicate instrument, and so for years, I wouldn't even want to guess how many. If I said 500, I might be right on, but certainly for years, that has been the method of choice to handle a bull, is to put a ring in his nose, because he would respect the tugging on his nose. So, and the reason I use that analogy is just the notion that if you're a candidate, the question, we like to have some transparency, some clarity as to who controls you. Whether you're actually there to do the job for the majority of the people who live in your area, or all the people in your area, or whoever is paying for your campaign. And I think we all would make the boast that if somebody walks through our door and they ask for help, that we're going to help them. And quite often, I think most members of the House would say they're not even aware of who donates in their campaigns. Usually when the receipts go out after our campaigns, or my campaign, I should say, I like to send a little note, thanks. And actually, that's the only time I really become aware of all the people who've actually donated in my campaign. So it is something that I think most candidates, because you have other people in your campaign who look after this, somebody's taking care of fundraising, somebody else is doing something else, that you can't always be aware of all the things that go on and all the people who are involved. And but we certainly like to think if someone donated to you, that's not a reason that you're going to excuse yourself from helping them. But the question of whether or not they would get more of a benefit from an elected person because they did that than someone who didn't is always the one that's uppermost on our minds, that we'd like to be sure that everybody lives in a level playing field, and that, I think for anybody who calls us, as much as is within our abilities, we would like to try to help, whether they vote for us or donate to us, that that represents real democracy. And there's no getting away from the fact that you're probably friendlier on the street to someone you knew who donated to you than perhaps a passerby who slapped snow on your shoe. So, Mr. Speaker, I guess Bill 117, as much as being an interesting piece of legislation, I think interesting probably interesting in its content, but certainly in the path of which it got here without going through the Electoral Commission, is one that I think people will talk about for some time, and I think we'll talk about who the beneficiaries of this legislation will be, and I'm hoping that at some point the members of our caucus will be on that side of the House to actually speak to the fact that this piece of legislation has not proven to be the benefit that the members who brought it to the House would have thought it would be. Mr. Speaker, when I think about all the organizations and the commodity groups and so on that I speak with and I talk to in my critic areas, how they look for a particular program or funding for some initiative that they want to see done either by Horticulture Nova Scotia or pork producers or Nova Scotia Cattlemen's Association or whoever. And I think about pretty near 9 years of doing this work and the continuous battles that I have carried out for these organizations, sometimes year after year, for what appears to be very little gain, Mr. Speaker. It can't seem to get government to do the thing that I think that they should do. And I think there are some fallacies that people believe. I think because of the way government appears to work, people believe, number one, that government works very slowly. That they think that the bureaucracy runs the ministers. And I think that quite often, if something doesn't change, in other words, the members of a particular party, they become on the government side of the House, the people who put them there think there will be a change because of the previous administration wouldn't budge on their issues, and then they don't change. The government doesn't change the issue. So the first thing that I think they're quite often told, Mr. Speaker, is, oh, well, it's really tough, the bureaucracy won't let us, and which I would tend to think, that the ministers are at the top of the heap when it comes to authority. And if they want something done, I think it's going to get done. Now, there may be some, yeah, I realize how naive I am. But there obviously is going to be that bit of debate and negotiation around the cabinet table for particular initiatives or incentives or whatever, and financing for particular projects. I can see those things being barriers to getting something done, Mr. Speaker. I don't see the bureaucracy's unwillingness to do it as the barrier. I think if the minister and the cabinet make a decision that something's going to happen and they're going to put the resources to it, then I believe it will happen. I think that they just tell the bureaucracy, this is what we want done, this is how we want it done, and we want an update once a month till you get it done. Now, but I do believe that if the government has no intention whatever to do something that the public wants done, then they will make that appear that there are so many hurdles and roadblocks in the way that it's so difficult in order to do this thing, and you'll see it come up on the agenda 1 year, and it'll come up on the agenda the next year, and 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and the group that keeps pushing to get this clarified or put through, well, if they're still around, they keep pushing for that to happen. But Mr. Speaker, that didn't happen with this piece of legislation. This piece of legislation came to this House lickety-split. There was no, you can quote me on that. There was no problem for the government to get this piece of legislation into this House and to get it here fairly quickly. And considering that, we had the election in June, we went back to the House in November, and presto, without much problem at all, this piece of legislation showed up fairly quickly. And I try to make this case to my constituents that anything the government wants to do, it can do it fairly quickly. And there are a lot of myths and a lot of misconceptions about what people think minority government means. I think people believe that the opposition actually has its hands on the rudder, controlling the ship of government in a much greater way than it does. I remember I went to one of the local lumber mills, and a gentleman there actually was one of my constituents, but he was working outside of my constituency. And he mentioned something about a loan for that mill or one mill, and he had some complaints about that, and he said, when that comes across your desk at the legislature, I want you to vote against it. And I said to him, I will never see it. That's not something that would come to the legislature. That'll go through the bureaucracy of Nova Scotia Business Inc. or just wherever. But I said, that's not something that MLAs see every day, and we would have no knowledge of that, and I wouldn't even have known it if he hadn't told me that. And I think what people don't recognize is the legislature is a slightly different vehicle than the running of the province. This is a place where legislation gets passed, or hopefully, in some cases. I think maybe, hopefully not in this case, Mr. Speaker, in the case of Bill 117. But this is a place where the government needs, at least 27 votes to get a bill passed. And people don't recognize that once the budget passes in the spring, Mr. Speaker, that the government basically runs as a majority. They have the ministers, they control the budget, and there is really no way for the opposition to move them on to a particular policy. I hear quite often the public saying, why don't you forget your partisan politics and work together to develop certain policy or whatever? Well, that'd be great if we had some power to implement it once we develop it, Mr. Speaker, but there is no mechanism. There is no mechanism for that. The ministers actually all run their departments, and they collectively run the ship. The Executive Council runs the province. They come to the legislation to pass legislation that may help them with that, and it may be just legislation for a particular society group or whatever group in the province, that, like dental hygienists or I know there was another group I had at the tip of my tongue. I lost it. But anyway, some of that is not necessarily related to the running of the province at all. They're more pertinent or personal to a particular organization that helps them with administration and structure and so on. And so in that way. But as far as the everyday running of the ship, if the ministers don't think they have support for legislation in a minority, then we probably won't see that particular piece of legislation. So I have to say, Mr. Speaker, in my office in Enfield, I'm not getting a whole lot of calls from people about Bill 117. Matter of fact, if there are issues and issues around poverty. Certainly recently, there's been a lot more contact in terms of hog producers and the situation facing agriculture. Roads never cease to be an issue at all. It doesn't seem to matter the time of year. And if there has been an upside, I guess, to coming into the legislature every day this week, it's been that the weather has been so good. It's been that the ability to travel. I know this may not apply to other members so much. It certainly applies to me because I'm a commuter. I travel out of the city and to home in Enfield every evening and back in the morning. So the condition of the roads is a major factor for me. And so if there's been any upside, it's that I certainly have been able to travel without too much worry about the roads, although on my way in today I did hear about an accident, or actually a couple of them. I was lucky that I avoided them or they weren't in my area. But so I see that as a possible upside of coming in to deal with Bill 117. But I don't see many others, Mr. Speaker, and I actually that kind of leads me to think, or leads me to worry about in my critic area what the downside is of this mild winter. I mean, here we had a big part of the agricultural community to the House on Tuesday, and basically here to show their concern for the hog industry, but there were a lot of other commodities, and I think that come spring we may find out that the damage for some of those other commodities is far worse because of this mild winter than we were expecting. I'm not sure what the negative impacts are going to be on the any of the blossom industries where regarding fruit industry, in particular apples and pears, etc. So a greater downside may be right around the corner as a result of what we might deem to be a really nice winter weather. That when we sit in the spring, maybe the minister should be thinking about the possibility of what kind of plans or programs or initiatives he may want to put into place, and with his 9.7 million, he might be looking down the road to determining what the negative aspects of this winter might be, and maybe he has already done that. Maybe he's got somebody in his staff that's taken this job on already, and that would be nice to think that he's being proactive and looking down the road, and actually to do this in a way that he can perhaps avoid spending money if he can get something in place. The old an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if he was thinking ahead and was going to be somewhat visionary, this might be an aspect that he would be willing to consider. Bill 117, I think when this week is over, and if we are to consider what the news story at the end of the week is going to be, then I don't think that Bill 117 is going to be at the top of anybody's list, and certainly for my constituents, I would expect that it's not. And I haven't spent enough time in Enfield and Elmsdale or at the local Tim Hortons to find out what the conversation has been this week. But I would be willing to bet that it's not going to be the limitations of Bill 117, and I think that it will add perhaps a little extra fuel to the fire in the sense of the government's or the people's lack of confidence, I think, in this present government, and if ever. Considering the June election results, if ever there was a party that needed a boost or a bump that was a positive one, this piece of legislation isn't going to do it, and certainly the events of the last week or so aren't going to do it. And I would think, and actually, this is a message that I think will fall on deaf ears, like so many of mine. I would say that the ministers should think about the fact that this is a party that's come through 2 elections with minority governments and actually fewer seats in this last election. And at some point, I think the people of Nova Scotia are going to wonder when this government is going to get the message. If we look back to 2003, after the 99 majority Conservative government, issues like the Digby Quarry, which took out a minister from the government side, but yet that didn't seem to cause any great dismay on the government side of the House, and they carried on in a minority in just about as arrogant a way as they might have with a minority. And so in 2006, we have another minority Conservative government with fewer seats than the previous, and certainly the actions of the Minister of Agriculture in the last few days would indicate that the government is still not going to be flexible when it comes to trying to come up with a long-term vision for that industry, and that is going to not pay dividends for the Conservative government down the road, especially with 2 ministers from Kings County, and I'm not sure whether those seats are 2 that they're interested in sacrificing. But certainly there's every good reason, I think, for those 2 ministers to be particularly sharp and on their toes around their constituency, because the ramifications of that in their communities is going to be significant in terms of the regional economic development for the area, and actually the negative impact. You have to understand that any dollars put out by the province to that industry is money that will come back to the province. It's not a net loss, and so if the minister thinks that part of that 9.7 or all of it will come back, then he would assume that 11.7 would come back, and so therefore all the more reason for a good case for helping out that industry. And I see absolutely nothing but a downside for the industry, for those communities, for those people, and for this government by not going further to help them. Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, the comment from the Minister of Agriculture, what would you do, close hospitals? He doesn't seem to see the link that by causing a demise in those communities actually could have that possible result. So it could mean the closing of schools. Even in the minister's own constituency, there was an issue about school closures, and this led to the moratorium on school closures. And the government does not see any connection, Mr. Speaker, between keeping young families working in rural Nova Scotia and keeping those schools open or keeping those hospitals open. And at some point, they would find that this would be a small amount invested in order to try to compensate for a larger amount of dollars to artificially support those institutions. So, well, I want to thank the member from Cape Breton for his intervention. I want to just let him know, because he may have missed some of my preamble on this, that my connection to Bill 117 in this regard is purely from the Premier's comments in question period about all the other issues in the province we have to deal with, that he seemed to be wanting to avoid questions in question period because of these more important issues, and I would take this to be a more important issue than Bill 117. So I'm glad. So Mr. Speaker, the time in this sitting, I think is probably growing to be quite short. I'm sure members on the government side are probably wishing it was shorter than it is. Well, well, if the members like listening to me, they don't seem to act on anything I say. Yes, perhaps after a half a dozen speakers, they've heard it. Well, I appreciate members opposite's comments, Mr. Speaker, and if I have more influence than anybody else, then I realize how little influence the rest of us have. So what? And I do want to say that when we refer to when I referred to the last election, that I put our rise in number of seats and popularity squarely in the hands of the gentleman to my left, who was more instrumental in getting us there than anybody. So what will be the end result of this week is in terms of this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker? I don't see any significant benefit to the people of Nova Scotia. More of their tax dollars are going to go toward political parties. I would think that for some people may not mind that. I think a lot of people will mind it. And and I think it always comes down to the issue. I think the member for Cape Breton North, Kings North, had made the comment back 2 years ago, 3 years ago, something to the effect that there were too many seats in the House of Assembly, that we should have maybe 40 instead of 52. And actually, it was someone, I can't think of the gentleman's name, I met him at one of the agricultural events, who was kind of promoting this notion. They thought that the member for Kings North was accurate on this. And I tried to make the case, well, why don't you only have one MLA? Because if 40 don't do any more for you, or if the government side doesn't do any more for you than governments have done, then you might as well have fewer MLAs rather than spending all that money on 52 salaries. And that's an issue I adhere to, that when we elect the government, that it should actually do something for its people. This is not a ship that the province runs, that the Progressive Conservatives run, for their own benefit. This is one that we try to see is run for the benefit of Nova Scotians. And actually, if any member was working like they should be, then there should be all kinds for 52 members to do. Matter of fact, it should be difficult for any member to get everything done, rather than thinking we should have less members and a bigger area and more constituents for them to have to work to satisfy and try to get back to. This, I think that if every member was working to their full capacity, then they'd be asking for help to try to get their work done, and not expecting that we could get the work done with less people, but with more people. I haven't said that, but I'll consider it. So, Mr. Speaker, it has been. I'm looking for a bill. It has been a. Not that bill. That bill. It has been a rough week, I think, for all members of the House. I think that when you see us deal with a piece of legislation like Bill 117, that the public is not crying for it all. Matter of fact, probably questioning why we would call the House back for this unique winter sitting, especially when we look at the comments in the paper around. We get the award for the least number of days that we sit, and then so to look at substantive legislation that we could have dealt with in the fall sitting that we didn't, then we come back and have a short sitting for one piece of legislation that the public isn't asking for, and have our Premier indicate to us that there are so many other issues that he would like to see dealt with, but yet hasn't brought any of those forward, and then to have our House visited by people who are in real need, who are in dire straits, in an industry that's part of the overall agricultural sector, that the government on more than one occasion has referred to as the backbone of the rural economy. The Minister of Agriculture, even prior to being Minister of Agriculture, would be quoted quite often as talking about farmers feed us all, and yet we've seen absolutely no initiative to help alleviate the stress on those families, and it's not just them. It spreads much larger than them. I think when the Mayor of Berwick comes and speaks on their behalf, that kind of indicates what he thinks the impact is going to be on his community, and yet we deal with Bill 117 that looks at trying to. Well, I think the message that's going to try to be sent by the government is that this is somehow progressive legislation that levels the playing field for the parties. I don't know how you include the legitimizing or legalizing of the Liberal Trust Fund in that. That's just an aside that's looped into this into this piece of legislation. You know, probably the issue around the $5,000 cap on union and corporate donations, if the bill had come through with that alone, that probably would have appeared to be a fairly, you could almost sell that as an equitable piece of legislation and how it affects all three parties. Throwing the Liberal Trust Fund into that and how the Liberal Party is able to use that is actually an aside or an addition that obviously must have come from some agreement with the Liberal Party. And I'm assuming around the budget in the spring, and it would have been nice to see the Liberals use some of that leverage to help the pork producers get some help in this last week. So, Mr. Speaker, it is a tough piece of legislation. Not much in terms of an upside for New Democrats in this legislation. I think if there is anything that we will claim as a gain, as a positive out of this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and I won't be supporting this piece of legislation. Let you know. It'll be that we have on the record. I will vote the right way on that. I'll tell the minister. We will have on the record our trying to ban corporate and union donations for all time in this province, which failed due to the Liberal and Conservative coalition. So with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I'll relinquish the floor to any other members who want to speak. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise and speak for the third time on this bill. And I just want to make sure that my comments are on the record, because I believe I bring a perspective that hasn't always been expressed around legislation. There haven't been many women except those members of our caucus who have spoken on this, and I think the legislation had the potential to have a tremendous, significant, progressive, proactive impact on increasing the participation of women in the political process. And I think it's a huge missed opportunity because of the gaps and some of the inconsistencies that we find in this bill number 117. And so I want to take this opportunity to get some comments on the record, because when I spoke previously, it was during a committee of the whole House, and those comments are not recorded in Hansard. So I want to, as I said earlier, this has the potential to do a lot of good in terms of reforming the democratic process in Nova Scotia, but the opportunity has been missed by this, perceived backroom deal between the two other parties. It could have eliminated the perception of undue influence on political decisions through large donations from corporations, from unions, and from organizations. And instead, I think after analysis of the political consequences for the Progressive Conservatives and the Liberal parties, they've come to some sort of halfway approach to benefit them, and they think to hurt the political aspirations of the NDP. But I think we can prove them wrong there. This bill had the potential of creating more representative governance. And I'm going to get into this in a little more detail, Mr. Speaker, because the bill could have included mechanisms to help more women and more representatives from minority groups get elected to this chamber. And that didn't happen. If there had been caps on political spending for certain political activities, I think it would have equalized the playing field somewhat for people who traditionally have not had the same access or the same opportunities to run for political office. And it also could have restored credibility to those of us who are elected. And I've mentioned this before, and my colleagues have also raised this point, that when you're elected to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly, the general public think that you're government. Now, I know many opportunities I have to seek out opinion in my community. When I'm talking to most people, to ordinary people, they tend to think that once you're elected, you're part of government. They don't understand the party system. They don't understand that the party with the most elected representatives is actually the governing body. They assume that we all have equal responsibility and equal ability to influence the decision-making in this chamber. And depending on the context, sometimes it's appropriate to explain how it actually works. Other times it's not really relevant because people want to get their point across, and I think my primary responsibility as an MLA is to listen to what they have to say, because it's usually a very good information, and it can be used to inform some of my decisions and some of my actions as a member of the NDP. The other lost opportunity with Bill 117 is that the government, with their advisors from the Liberal Party, could have actually looked at what's happening across Canada and what happened at the federal level. There's been a lot of activity around electoral reform in Canada, and a number of different models for involving and informing the community have been used in different areas of the country. We could have had our pick, we could have modified it, but one thing they have in common, the common ground I found in looking at what's happened in various provinces, is that they took the time to make sure that the information about what they're proposing, why they're proposing it, and what the possible impacts might be. All the options have been shared with the general public. There's been many different opportunities for people to be able to learn more about the democratic process and how it might be improved through electoral reform. We don't see any effort by this bill or the process being used to fast track it through the approval process. We don't see any attempt to make a genuine effort to involve the community. So there, again, is another lost opportunity, Mr. Speaker. Another aspect I want to mention is the lack of transparency. There certainly could have been included a number of different sections or clauses in this legislation that would have restored public confidence in the whole process of transparency. And I'll just pull out one as an example, that if there was timely reporting and full disclosure of who contributes to leadership campaigns, I think, especially in this age where we seem to be changing leaders quite frequently in some parties, I think there would be an opportunity to restore confidence that the public would have in the political process. And as I mentioned, the meaningful consultation. When things are done to people and done to groups of people without informing them, without involving them, they don't feel that they have a stake. They don't feel connected to the legislation. Now, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that everybody is saying, Mr. Speaker, that nobody cares about this piece of legislation. It's not being discussed in the coffee shops. It's not being discussed on the corner. Of course not, because they don't know about its significance. They don't realize that the consequences, whether intended or unintended, of this piece of legislation will impact on them every day for the rest of their lives. And that's the danger That's the danger, Mr. Speaker, in fast-tracking this piece of legislation. Because I believe, as well-intended perhaps as the other members of the other two parties in this chamber are, I don't think some of them understand what they're doing and what the possible impacts might be. The other reason I'm pleased to have an opportunity to discuss Bill 117 for a third time is my concern about the process we're using to approve it. Traditionally in Nova Scotia, changes to the democratic process have come through the All-Party Elections Committee. And this has been our traditional way of reform. And we've been given no explanation as to why that particular committee or mechanism was not used this time. We also haven't received sufficient explanation as to why we've been brought back for this rare winter sitting of the legislature. We were discussing this bill towards the end of the fall session last year, and certainly when we finished or adjourned our debate on the bill, we understood that the other two parties in this chamber had recognized the value of taking a little bit more time and trying to get more input from the electorate. And I know there was some talk about a select committee that might actually be composed of one or two members of each party, and that would travel around the province, both informing people who were interested, but also seeking their involvement and their input in terms of what they would like to see to improve the democratic process. And certainly it needs improvement. I'm going to discuss later that the cynicism of the voter has really created a problem, a credibility problem that is resulting in lower turnout at successive provincial elections and a number of other consequences that I think are serious symptoms of a democratic deficit in this province and things that we have to look at quite seriously, Mr. Speaker. We have some very good models from other provinces about how this process could have been improved. So I'm not sure what the status of the Select Committee on, I'll call it on the democratic reform. I don't know what the status of it is. You know, there was a rumor at one point, I believe I saw some mention in the media, that that committee may be set up, but that it would be reporting back in June. Now that just doesn't make any sense, and it makes one question the motivation behind Bill 117. If a select committee may be set up to produce some comprehensive strategies or plans for reforming the electoral process in Nova Scotia, why would we take out this particular piece of that electoral reform and rush it through a rare sitting of the legislature in January? Does not make sense. Other provinces have done it quite differently. Some have set up a third-party commission. I believe in Prince Edward Island, a retired Supreme Court judge had been tasked with looking at some of these same issues. Other provinces have put together a citizens committee, I believe in BC. In Quebec, they actually brought together 1,000 residents, 1,000 citizens of that province in a 2 or 3 day forum to talk about some of these issues. Each province, has found a method that they feel would work very well in their particular area of the province, of the country, but in all cases, it's allowed for involvement of the public in some of these decisions and how the process would move forward. So what message are we in Nova Scotia giving to our citizens when we sort of behind closed doors, come up with this proposal, try to fast-track it through a rare sitting of the legislature, and do it in a way that isolates both the community and I think the media somewhat as well, because they have, quite frankly, been preoccupied with other matters this week and perhaps are not concentrating on a very valuable piece of legislation that had the potential to really change the democratic system in Nova Scotia, but is just doing it in such a piecemeal, sporadic, superficial way that it's not going to meet those expectations at all. I too share the frustration of my colleagues. I would prefer to be here in this chamber talking about the issues that are so important and so relevant to our citizens. We've had several demonstrations this week. We continue to get letters and emails and phone calls from constituents in our home areas, all talking about things that they think are very, very significant, very important to them and their families. And are we able to deal with those things? No. What we're dealing with is a very superficial piece of legislation that doesn't go far enough, that pretends to be electoral reform, that may actually jeopardize the future of electoral reform in this province. And it's just so frustrating not to be able to deal with significant change that is actually going to have a very positive, progressive impact on our citizens. Now, I talked about unintended consequences, and certainly some of my colleagues in the NDP caucus have detailed what some of those are. It appears that the government and the third party think that they are harming our chances of electoral success. And I think it's been pointed out by some of my colleagues that some of the money that's going to be available to, for example, the Liberal Party, some of those candidates representing that party are actually going to threaten the electoral success of some of the government members. And I'm just curious to know whether there's been any change in thinking, any change in the level of support from the government caucus after having some of those, as I call them, unintended consequences fully explained and illustrated to them. And it boggles my mind, Mr. Speaker. It absolutely boggles my mind as to the rationale of the government in giving an opposition party such an advantage as allowing them to keep their trust funds. I can't rationalize it. It just does not make sense to me at all. Now, I've mentioned before in this chamber that not only am I a member of the NDP caucus, but I'm probably the only MLA in this chamber who is a current past president of a political party. I actually was. He's the current past president? No, I'm a current past president because I actually was president of the NDP provincially when I ran, and when I was successful, when I was successful, I resigned as president of the party. But the current president is just one president removed, and so I'm still the current past president. I have a very full and detailed understanding of how my political party works. And I understand the challenges of fundraising. I understand the temptation to go after public funding of political parties and campaigns. And I understand the impact of a lot of the clauses in this particular piece of legislation. And it's interesting because some of them are so inconsistent that as I said before, it boggles my mind as to why some of these are being pushed by the government in particular. I won't speculate as to why I think this might be happening. That's perhaps getting a little bit outside my area of expertise, but it does raise the question. And I guess what bothers me the most is that these questions are going to be raised in the media, these questions are going to be raised in the public, and I think it's going to continue to undermine the credibility of politicians in Nova Scotia. And we all suffer from that. We're all branded in the same way. So that voter frustration and that voter disillusionment is something that we're all going to wear, no matter what party we represent. And we see that voter frustration all the time. It's been mentioned before that voter turnout in Nova Scotia continues to decline each provincial election. And I just want to give you a few figures. In 1998, for example, the voter turnout was 75.76%. In 1999, it went down to 68.12%. In 2003, it declined further to 65.79%. And then last year, it went down to 59.89%. Now, those figures all come from the Elections Nova Scotia website, and I believe they are quite accurate. Why are people not going out to vote? I think there are several reasons. One, they don't think their vote counts. I'm not as familiar with the public school program as I used to be. But I know many, many years ago when I was in junior high in particular, we had what we called a civics class. And it was during those classes that we learned about municipal, provincial, and federal politics. And, I found those classes fascinating, never dreaming that I would one day be standing here in the Nova Scotia House of Assembly discussing that experience. But I'm not sure that young people today actually feel connected to the political process. I think another reason that the public is so cynical and it doesn't get out to vote, and that's something that we need to be very conscious of, because I think this legislation had the potential of increasing that relationship between the voter and the political process. But another reason that the general public voting patterns are going down is because government and political institutions, Mr. Speaker, are viewed as unwilling or unable to address the issues that are important to people. And I'm just wondering what's going through the head of the people who are protesting today outside this province house, concerned about burning tires for fuel. I'm wondering about the hog farmers and other representatives of the agricultural community and their supporters who were here earlier in the week. Do they feel that we were listening? Do they feel that we're reacting? Do they feel that we actually see their problems, their concerns, their issues as a high priority? I doubt it very much. More and more Nova Scotians feel disconnected from what happens in this chamber and from the work that we do. They feel disconnected from the whole business of governing. And that's why we need to be taking Bill 117 more seriously. That's why we need to be looking for a comprehensive strategy to help people feel connected, to help people feel that what we do here, the political process, actually has an impact on their lives, and that it should provide hope for a better future, and a hope that there are people who feel that they are there serving the general public. I think another reason that they feel disconnected is they don't recognize the impact of what we do here on their daily lives. They don't realize that public policy and legislation impacts on every aspect of their lives, from the time they get up in the morning to the time that they go to bed and while they're sleeping. I'm not going to get into all the details, but there's a lot of that education and awareness raising that could be done through government, through the other political parties, through good policy development, and certainly through legislative reform. But we've missed that opportunity because we're fast-tracking this in a way that the media are not talking about it, fast-tracking it in a way that it's almost, we've become a laughing stock. It's frustrating, I know as a member of my party, to be taking this so seriously and to be accused of just, wasting everyone's time. That is so frustrating because we have such an opportunity here and we are losing it. We are losing it. People are not taking it seriously enough. Now, some of you may realize that I'm also, I'm the critic for the status of women. So I'm very interested in issues that impact on women and families in this province. I'm also the first critic for the voluntary sector in this province. And I have, I'm guessing, perhaps a 35-year involvement with the voluntary sector in Nova Scotia. And I have witnessed the degree of frustration felt by volunteers and families, particularly women, by program cuts and privatization, Mr. Speaker, and downloading. And the reason I mention that is because legislation and public policy is not neutral. It impacts on different groups of people to different degrees. And it's very frustrating because Bill 117 had the potential of perhaps improving access to the political process for women and people of people belonging to minority subpopulations in this province, and it did not, did not take that seriously. There's nothing in there to level the playing field for people who traditionally have not been encouraged or supported in getting involved in the political process. I will come back to that, but the last point I want to talk about in terms of why the voters are cynical and to some degree getting more inactive in the political process is, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, their lack of trust in politicians. Now, some of you may be aware that on an annual basis, Canadian Press and the Leger marketing survey people do a survey across Canada measuring the level of trust of Canadians in certain professions. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I do want to get it on the record, and there may be some people listening who didn't hear my explanation or analysis earlier. All categories, trust of Canadians in all categories of professions that were surveyed have gone down each year. But, Mr. Speaker, would it surprise you to know who makes up the category that is least trusted by Canadians? Now, I realize you can't answer me, but you're shaking your head. And I want to tell you, the group of people least trusted by Canadians in this country as a profession are politicians. Politicians. They're not only at the bottom of the ranking, that the level of trust goes down each succeeding year. Now, I don't know about anyone else in this chamber, but that concerns me a lot. Because I think there is a lot of interest among politicians today to prove to the electorate that we are a new and different breed. And yet, the content of Bill 117, the way that we're rushing it through the approval process, just reinforces for the average Canadian that we don't deserve their trust. They view us in that old stereotypical way of just out for our own interests or our own party's interest. And we're not going to break through those myths for the most part. I mean, there may be a few of that type of politician around, but, generally I have a lot of respect for the people in this chamber. I know that you work as hard as I do and that you have your constituents' concerns and interests as your prime motivation. But there's a breakdown between how we're perceived and how we act sometimes and what we're trying to be in terms of this new breed, this new way of doing politics in Nova Scotia. Now, it's interesting, Mr. Speaker, because I was astounded to see which categories of professions ranked higher.
I know.
Ranked higher.
It's the third time I heard it.
Put your hand up, Stu.
That ranked higher than politicians. Yes, okay.
Last, followed by lawyers.
Okay, yes. Down, class, down. I'm trying to. The categories that ranked higher than politicians are journalists. I can't even hear myself think, Mr. Speaker. Journalists, lawyers, insurance brokers, real estate agents, unionists or union members, publicists, and car salespeople. Now, we're below all those groups in trust. Yeah. So you might ask, Mr. Speaker, why are these public attitudes relevant to Bill 117? Well, they are because they just prove that Canadians, especially, or I should say including Nova Scotians, are disillusioned and frustrated with politicians and the political process. And here we are dealing with inadequate legislation, rushing it through this chamber in a way that's going to feed into that perception. We're rushing this through the legislature in a way that's going to harbor suspicions that politicians in the province of Nova Scotia continue to be self-serving and are afraid to allow meaningful, informed public input. I don't think that is the impression that we want to leave with the voters of Nova Scotia. Now, you can always learn other things from surveys, and I thought it might be interesting to mention the groups of people that were most trusted in the last survey that by CP and Leger Marketing, the groups of people that were most trusted by Canadians, because I think there is something that we can learn from this. They include firefighters, nurses, farmers, and doctors. Now, I'm in trying to analyze this on just a superficial level, Mr. Speaker. What do these groups have in common? And what I've pulled out from this is that firefighters, nurses, farmers, doctors, when they do their work, they prepare, they plan, they work together, they deliver, they don't procrastinate and delay and make excuses. And I think that is what citizens expect from their politicians as well. Now just imagine this scenario, Mr. Speaker. A fire truck pulls up to a house that's on fire. Perhaps you live next door. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. Everyone rushes out in their pajamas, neighbors and residents of the house that's in flames. Now, can you imagine if the fire captain looked at the situation and said, sorry, we don't have enough money to fight that fire. Or we're going to study your problem. Or we'll think about helping you in the next budget. Or the program's full, let's turn around and go back to the station. No, when you look at farmers, I mean, here we've heard this week the situation where farmers are subsidizing our food. I mean, they're taking money out of their pockets in order to provide pork in this province. Now, how less, I mean, that's the most generous thing possible. Here they're looking for a little help in order to allow them to actually meet the cost of production of that pork, and we're ignoring them. You can see the credibility gap between the professions that Canadians admire and perhaps why we're at the bottom of the list. Now, lack of faith and trust in politicians, Mr. Speaker, I think is a big concern. It should be a big concern for everyone in this chamber. Because like you, I would suspect that all of us served our community in a variety of ways before we ran for election to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly. And I know certainly 5 years ago I would never have dreamed of being here. But I realize now that being an MLA is another way of doing community service, serving one's community. And certainly the approach that I like to use, Mr. Speaker, is respecting others' points of view. So it's important to me. I know I don't have all the answers. I admit that perhaps my caucus doesn't have all the answers. But I would suggest that the more people that can provide their point of view, the more people that get involved in brainstorming, the more we include different points of view, the better the result, the better the decision, the better the process. I wanted to hear from marginalized groups in particular about electoral reform. I wanted the chance to talk to other women. I wanted the chance to talk to people with disabilities. I wanted the chance to talk to people from minority groups, all groups that are severely, severely underrepresented in this chamber. I remember shortly after I was elected, Mr. Speaker, 2 women from a Middle East country were in Halifax taking some education programs. They wanted to meet with a woman politician, and so they came to meet with me in my office. And I remember them telling me that in their country, they weren't allowed to vote and they weren't allowed to run for election. And they were returning to their country, and they asked me, just off the top of my head, what argument could I provide them that they could take back to their country and explain why this wasn't right, this wasn't fair? And I must admit they sort of stunned me with the question. I'd never met anyone from a country that wasn't able to vote or take part in the political process. But the argument that immediately came to mind was, if you had a pool of talent to do anything in your country, why would you automatically disqualify half or 52%, as it is in Canada, disqualify people from taking part? I mean, it's not in anyone's best interest to take the talent and interest and knowledge and experience of a significant number of your citizens and prevent them from taking part in the democratic process. But because of our systemic barriers to women, I'll use women as an example in Nova Scotia, to women's inclusion in the political process, we are not taking advantage of that pool of talent that we have in our own province. Now, I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, that legislation is not neutral, and it impacts differently on different groups of people. Now, I've been asking for some time in this chamber to have a gender lens on the public policy and the legislation that comes before this House. And what that would do would analyze and state how the legislation would impact on women in particular. Now, let me just give you an example. Long before my time in this chamber, there were decisions made about, for example, and this was done, I recognize it was done in order to increase the financial viability of certain programs and hopefully be able to reallocate resources to do more things. But just look at the impact of quick discharge from hospitals, like day surgery, and other procedures within the health field that supposedly allow patients to go home much more quickly and recover in the home setting, which I think most people would agree is usually a more relaxing, positive atmosphere than recovering in hospital. But because we didn't have a gender lens on some of those decisions, I don't think what people realized is that the caregiving burden for looking after those patients when they returned home into their communities fell for the most part on women in our province. And so you might have saved a little money, but what you did was pull women out of the workforce for significant lengths of time in order to care for husbands or parents or children or grandchildren while they were recovering from an operation or an injury. This also impacted on women's involvement in the voluntary sector. So especially in rural communities, you saw decreased hours available for community activity by women because they were having to stay home and more look after people who had been discharged early from hospital or who were using the day surgery program. Now that's just a small example, but I don't think anyone realized the impact on women and the fact that in some cases, because of the deinstitutionalizing of people with mental health conditions and people with disabilities, the long-term care provided by many women in our communities has actually interfered with their financial security in the future. Some of them have actually had to leave their jobs. It's going to impact on their public pensions and private pensions. And so it may create a dependency on government programs down the road. These are what I call the unintended consequences. And this is what happens when you don't have a certain lens, whether it's, can be environmental, it can be a broad community health lens, or it can be what I call a gender lens. So getting back to Bill 17, I want to show the relevance of what I'm discussing. Excuse me. Part of the new political activity, I think, is being more responsive, wanting to involve the community, having more input from community members. And because we have rushed this piece of legislation through the legislature, we're not going to have a chance to talk to all the people we need to find out the impact of what's in the legislation, what's in Bill 117. We're also not going to realize the impact of what's not in Bill 117. And I know from my own personal experience that this current bill, this current piece of legislation is going to impact on women, Mr. Speaker, and their access to the political process much differently from men. Now, Mr. Speaker, you might argue that the women in this legislature can speak on behalf of the women in the province. Well, we try, and I'm very proud to say that all 5 women NDP caucus members have spoken at length on this legislation. There are obviously missing women's voices in this chamber, and I challenge them to get up and voice and represent the women of this province. even though the five of us have spoken, collectively, we don't cover all the experiences and all the different perspectives that might come from consulting with more women across the province. And why is this bill so important to women? It's because women make up 52% of the population. But I wonder if anyone can name off the top of their head the percentage of women actually represented in this chamber when we have all 52 members here, which I'm sure we do today, Mr. Speaker. 17%, 17%, yes. This is the highest percentage that we have ever had in the Nova Scotia House of Assembly. 17%. And women make up 52% of the Nova Scotian population. Now, I can tell you that getting elected to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly is still a challenge for women in this province, and also for other marginalized groups. Now, women, unlike the Middle East country that the two women I spoke of a little earlier came from, women in Nova Scotia have been able to vote and have been able to run in provincial elections since 1918. 1918. That's 89 years ago. 89 years. Now, we've had 24 general elections in 89 years. 24 general elections. We didn't have a woman elected to this chamber until 1960, when Gladys Porter, who had been the mayor of Kemptville, was elected. 1960. And how many women have ever been elected to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly in 24 general elections? I'll just let you think about that for a second. Pretty close. 26. 26, yes. And would you like to know what parties they represented? 26 women elected in 89 years, and we're 52% of the population. Now, do you think that's fair? Do you think there's something going on there that women don't get elected to represent other women in this, and men and children in this province? Of the 26, 10 were or are NDP, because this includes the current contingent of women in this chamber. 10 from the NDP, 10 from who were progressive conservative, and 6 liberals. 26 women in 89 years. And how do we rate across Canada? We're in the middle of the pack. So except for Quebec, which I think is well ahead, and obviously that is a electoral reform piece of legislation that we need to be looking at. That could have been a model for changing the situation, I think, here in Nova Scotia. So Bill 117, does this bill actually create more opportunities? Does it create a fairer playing field for women in our province? Will it increase the representation of women? Will it help make this chamber more representative of the population of Nova Scotia? I doubt it very much, because that wasn't even an objective of this piece of legislation. Who knows? Who knows if we had included a clause that minimized, if we included a clause that eliminated completely corporate, organizational, and union donations, and limited spending, or puts caps on spending limits on some categories, it might have been surprising what a positive impact that might have had in changing the representation in this chamber. Now, it may be there's no interest. in this chamber representing the actual population and subpopulation groups of Nova Scotia. But I think that's the higher standard, that's the higher expectation that informed Nova Scotians expect today. It's interesting because any study done to analyze why women have a problem getting elected or why they're discouraged from running for office, it always includes the issue of financial resources. And that's why even if we look at Bill 117 as a purely funding mechanism for political parties, it should be addressing some of these issues to make our process much more inclusive. Last fall, a number of very credible organizations in Nova Scotia released a report entitled Untapped Resources, Women in Municipal Government in Nova Scotia. Now, untapped resources, interesting, it refers back to the analogy I could use to that pool of talent, untapped resources. Now, a consultation and a study was done that was sponsored by the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities, the Halifax YWCA, Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women, and Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations. It's interesting, they updated and confirmed findings from other studies that had been done both in Nova Scotia and I would suggest across Canada that confirmed some of the challenges and barriers to women's participation in the political process. And certainly the financial barrier is one of the big ones. Because the reality of being a woman in Nova Scotia today, Mr. Speaker, is that we earn lower incomes on average. We earn 71 cents for every dollar earned by a man, even when the women have higher qualifications and training. Another reality of being a woman in Nova Scotia is that women usually have less discretionary money. Their money goes for the everyday necessities of raising a family or being independent in this province. And so they don't have the extra money that it takes to cover the personal costs of running for a nomination for a political party. They don't have the extra money, for the most part, to cover the personal costs of actually being in a campaign. The reality of being a woman in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, is also that we are especially, I'll call it, time challenged. We're always multitasking. We're always juggling paid work, voluntary work, caregiving to elders and to children and grandchildren, and we're also juggling all the multiple tasks involved with household management. And so it often leaves very little time to get involved in the grassroots and work your way up through the political process to become a candidate. And yet, when you look at the bulk of supporters and workers behind the scenes in political campaigns, I would suggest that many of them are women in our communities. And finally, in terms of women's ability to raise have access to the financial assets that we need to run in elections, either to get a line of credit or to cover those personal costs. Women don't have generally in Nova Scotia the same access, the same assets that they can use to get that line of credit and to sort of bankroll the personal costs and expenditures that are associated with political campaigns. So if we'd had more time to consult on this bill, I'm sure that there would have been suggestions, Mr. Speaker, to put ceilings on spending for various activities, including nominations, which is sort of the entry point, in the political process for a lot of people. So why is it important that Bill 117 proactively increase women's participation as elected officials? I would suggest that we would have better decision-making if more women were involved at all levels of the political process. It's important that women's perspectives, and I use women as a category because they're 52% of the population, but you could substitute any of the other, any minority group representation in here, and you would have the same positive benefit from their inclusion. Because if you deal with issues that are important to that group or deal with issues that are important to women and their families in Nova Scotia, it's going to increase the relevancy and the effectiveness of public policy and legislation for all Nova Scotians in this province, not just women. It's interesting that the one opportunity for any public input on this bill during law amendments happened in the pre-Christmas, pre-holiday season, when, as we all know, women who disproportionately bear the burden of holiday and Christmas preparation are probably the most busy in the entire year. And so I think even if there were some groups, I actually wasn't able to be at the Law Amendments Committee meetings, but I would be interested to know how many women actually presented to law amendments. I suspect it was either none or very little, and I know because that's often a peak time, both in their paid work and also in their volunteer side and in their perhaps union. So 2 of the 8 were women, I am led to understand. That's a very low percentage, and I think even if we had done as limited participation as the law amendments process allows, if we had done it any other time of the year, I would almost guarantee that there would be a much higher percentage of women taking part in that process. I understand, as I mentioned earlier, from my perspective as a past president of a political party, the operational needs and the pressures on political parties and the challenges in this day and age. I understand the temptation of the other 2 political parties to sort of rush into this to provide stable public funding for their political parties, especially when they think perhaps it's going to undermine the efforts of my own party. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there are some flaws in their logic here, and it's a bit scary to see the way that certain aspects of electoral reform have been sort of cherry-picked and put together in this package without understanding that the dynamics of those could actually undermine not only what they hope to achieve in terms of stabilizing party funding, but also in terms of undermining even further public confidence in their parties. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about my frustration with the inclusion of the Liberal so-called investment fund, trust fund in this legislation, except that I would like to challenge any candidate. I realize it's going to be after the fact, and I am not a suspicious person. I tend to look for the best in everyone, but there's a little voice that wonders in the back of my mind. Is one of the reasons we're rushing this through, Mr. Speaker, is so that the candidates for the Liberal leadership race do not have to take a stand on the Liberal trust funds. I don't know. It just keeps pecking away inside my brain.
None of the Liberals are taking a stand.
And it's frustrating because this this trust fund, no matter what source of information you look at, has to be considered suspicious. You know, whether you look at the journalistic exposés, whether you look at the judicial decisions, whether you you look at or consider information gained from people within the party, any source of information raises huge questions around the source of this money. So why would it be included? Why would it be legitimized in this legislation? It actually gives an advantage to a party other than the governing party. I can't imagine why they went along with this, unless they're getting something in return. Who knows? But what message is that sending to the public? I've talked previously about the Federal Accountability Act and Action Plan that actually only received royal assent last month. And it prohibits members of Parliament from using trust funds for political purposes. And the rationale for a number of the recommendations and action or pieces of legislation, clauses in their legislation, the rationale for a number of them is that they don't want politicians to have access to funds, quote, from unknown original sources. From unknown original sources. Well, if any original source could be considered suspect, I would suggest it's the origin of the Liberal Trust Fund here in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, there are so many reasons why this Bill 117 should not pass. It has the seeds of possible genuine electoral reform, but it has to be considered much more thoroughly both by this chamber, and it also has to be discussed and shared with the general public in a way that they can make a meaningful and informed contribution to the discussion. This is too important to rush through. This is too important to do it in a piecemeal, inferior, superficial way that actually is going to harm the reputations of all politicians in this province, not just the two parties that are working together to get it through. I'm really discouraged and I'm really disappointed. And, you know, I know we can do much better. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a sad day in Nova Scotia. Thank you.
Thank you. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to take my place in the legislature to speak on Bill 117 for the third and final time before a vote is taken. Mr. Speaker, there are two aspects of the bill that I want to address. The $3.4 million trust fund of the Nova Scotia Liberal Party and the Liberal Conservative refusal to eliminate union and corporate donations to political parties in Nova Scotia. In earlier debate, I used the phrase, remove the shackles of influence. To remove the shackles of influence by banning all union and corporate donations. However, Mr. Speaker, at this time, I want to address the issue of held assets. Assets that came in part by ill-gotten gain, that came in part in the form of a 25-cent a quart levy on spirits, on liquor sold in Nova Scotia Liquor Commission at that time, stores throughout the province, a highly organized and very lucrative kickback system. Last night, last night, Mr. Speaker, the MLA for Halifax Citadel and I had supper with two of my three children, my daughters Jill and Sarah. And at one point, the member for Halifax Citadel asked if they were interested in seeking public office. And the response was more perhaps, rather than the affirmative. Now, it's my hope that more and more young people will show an interest in seeking public office. And I also hope, Mr. Speaker, that one or more of my children may someday seek public office, as their dad has done on 7 occasions. But Mr. Speaker, I certainly hope that they do that after I have several terms, and I'm sure that with Bill 117, we will have the ammunition. We have the ammunition. Now, how can we encourage young people to seek office where there is such a large collection of political garbage in Nova Scotia? Garbage from years gone by and an unwillingness to get rid of it, to dispose of it, to come clean. This Bill 117 meant nothing to the people of Pictou East last week. No one was mentioning it. Absolutely no one was mentioning it. It meant little to Nova Scotia in general. If you were to have taken a poll geared to Bill 117, most people would not have known what Bill 117 was all about. Mr. Speaker, that is changing. That is changing. And this is due to the NDP, to our efforts to make fundamental changes in the financing of political parties, to do away with the union and corporate donations, and to end once and for all the blemish on Nova Scotia politics, the blemish of the trust funds. $3.4 million could be used for so many good things, and the Liberals would be responsible for those good things. As it is now, the Liberals will be haunted by the trust fund, haunted in the pending leadership campaign, haunted in the next election, haunted by the press, and haunted in the ballot boxes. In addition, Mr. Chair, the Liberals will have no crutch. There will no longer be a crutch that the NDP gets substantial dollars from the unions. Because, Mr. Speaker, we wanted to give up the 13% or more that we get from the unions, and we wanted to rely on average Nova Scotians for donations, average Nova Scotians from individuals. So if we couldn't give up the union donations in 2007 because of the Liberal-Conservative tag team, we went to Plan B, a maximum of $5,000 in 2007, $4,000 in 2008, $3,000 in 2009, and an end to all union and corporation donations by January the 1st, 2010. Again, the Liberals and the Conservatives join forces to defeat our efforts. Mr. Chair, that's from twice in committee, I guess. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are propping up the fledgling Conservatives. And perhaps after this week, I should say the floundering Conservatives.
No, that's too severe.
To prop is to support. It is to brace. But on Bill 117, the props are not poles, they are pillars. They are pillars. And on a numerous other cases and in numerous other instances, the props are pillars. Sure, Mr. Speaker. There is rhetoric. Yes, there is rhetoric from over there. There is rhetoric from the Liberals in question period. They put the questions in question period. They participate in the press scrums and the general appearance of being separate. In reality, Mr. Speaker, they are joined at the hip on many issues. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, that they are actually joined right here on the hip, on the wallet side of the hip. That is where they are joined. Let's for a moment examine the Liberal-Conservative alliance to examine how firm the support is, to see how the T's are crossed, to see how the I's are dotted. Well, can we in fact do that? Mr. Speaker, no one really knows how formal the agreement really is, but it's easy to speculate. It's very easy to speculate. Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, I wonder aloud whether or not the agreement goes beyond an agreement. I wonder if it actually goes beyond an agreement. On Tuesday in debate, a member referred to the Liberals and Conservatives as being a coalition. And a coalition they may be. In my mind, this picture comes to my mind repeatedly. I can't help thinking of them as sort of the popsicle twins. And that's a strange blend of red and blue and blue and red and red and blue. And many of you with children, and in my case with grandchildren, many of you with children and grandchildren have seen those multicolored popsicles. You've seen those multicolored popsicles. And they have those two little sticks. You know, two little props sticking out of them. There are two little props sticking out of them. Mr. Speaker, you know what happens to those popsicles when there is heat? They melt quickly. They melt quickly. And in this sitting of the House, the Liberals and Conservatives are melting. They're melting. They're melting with the heat that's being put on them. And you know, Mr. Speaker, that this heat is just coming from a couple of sunsets. That's all it's coming from. It's coming from a couple of sunsets. Now, one can say that the NDP government worked with the Ham government to keep it in power for 3 years. And actually, that compromising and cooperation went on until after Dr. Ham had retired. It went on right up until the election call. But there was a fundamental difference, and that's what I want to talk about, is the fundamental difference. The NDP and the Conservatives worked on issues that benefit Nova Scotia and benefited Nova Scotians. Contrast that to Bill 117. The sole reason for this special January sitting of this House, with dozens of other issues more important to Nova Scotia and Nova Scotians. Bill 117 has two main benefactors, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. Both want to keep the large corporate donations, and the Liberals want to keep the bad money trust fund. Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, I find it totally appalling that both the Liberals and the Conservatives have had no one, absolutely no one, speaking on Bill 117.